Welcome to Proles of the Round Table.
Hello and welcome to Proles of the Round Table, your bi-weekly dose of history without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at ProlesPod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. This episode is brought to you by Deutsche Bank, who gifted us with a lifetime supply of Haribo candies.
It's generous.
Thank you. Today we're going to be talking about Subversion in the GDR. And who do we have with us today?
Jeremy.
There's me, Justin, and then our subject matter expert is none other than the legendary Tony.
The man.
How you doing?
The myth.
Doing good.
Sweet. Where do you want to begin?
Today we're actually going to be talking about the DDR. Not, unfortunately, Dance Dance Revolution, but perhaps we could do an episode later on how that is the perfect kind of analogy for class struggle, but not today. We're going to be talking about the Deutsche Democratic Republic, also known as the German Democratic Republic, or GDR in English. And I think we all most commonly know it as East Germany. So we'll be looking at the various ways that Western capitalist powers attempted to subvert and ultimately destroy this nascent socialist state. A goal, of course, at which they ultimately succeeded in 1989. The focus of this episode will be from 1946, the division of the Germanys, to 1961, which saw the installation of the Berlin Wall. So what I hope that you guys listening get from this episode is an understanding of what capitalist powers will do to subvert nations, actions they did before the events we were going to speak about in this episode, and continue to do to this day. We'll look at the security concerns faced by socialist countries under siege, and hopefully provide some contextualization of the Berlin Wall, which we never get.
Right.
So if you're familiar with the other podcasts I host, Actually Existing Socialism, you know that I love speaking and learning about East Germany. I've actually had 2 guests on the show who lived in the GDR for a prolonged period. One, a native German named Bruni de la Motte, and Victor Grossman, an American soldier who defected in 1953. There's also an OG Proles episode I recommend people check out as well, and it's called The Rise of, Life in, and the Fall of the German Democratic Republic. Definitely one of the best podcasts I've listened to in regards to East Germany. So definitely check those out. While certainly the events that I'm going to talk about should be understood as a subversion of a communist or socialist country by capitalist intrigue, this is actually more than that because it's a subversion of democracy, of peace, of humanity. And we see all this going back to where it all started, in the division of the Germanys. Following World War II, at the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, the Allied powers determined that the defeated Nazi Germany would be dismembered and divided into 4 military occupation zones as a way to subdue the country politically and militarily, and to also, of course, utilize its resources for reparations in the post-war rebuilding. The zones were as follows: the US in the south, France in the southwest, UK in the northwest, and of course, the Soviet Union in the east. The purpose of the division was to carry out a program which has been referred to as the 5 Ds: demilitarization, denazification, decentralization, democratization, and decardalization. I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing that last one right, decardalization, but it sounds almost
cartels?
like annihilation or something like that, or like to dismember, but it's...
Is it like cartels, like decartelization?
Yeah,
okay.
So break up
that makes
cartels.
sense.
So I guess this maybe just sounds weird.
Was that a problem? Was that a thing that existed in Germany?
Yes.
Or what does it mean specifically? Do you know?
Yeah. So I'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
Patient.
All right.
No.
Sorry.
So the goal was the eventual unification of a free and democratic Germany after the 5 Ds had been successfully implemented in the 4 zones. However, such an outcome was doomed from the start, and what eventually played out in other post-war partitions, such as in Korea, Vietnam, was a breakdown of previously agreed to terms, of course, mostly on the part of the Western capitalist powers.
I think you mean Soviet aggression.
You're right. Soviet aggression and Stalin twirling his mustache easily.
Hell yeah.
So of the 4 Allied powers, France from the beginning was the most
Can we talk about how I don't think it's actually possible for Stalin to twirl his mustache because it's like very thick and very like cropped to his face.
Wow.
Do you think he could twirl it?
This is the important
This
stuff
is why
right
you
here.
guys listen to Proles. You get the grade A information, stuff you won't hear anywhere else.
Right. Mustache discourse.
From the beginning, after Germany was divided between the four occupying powers, France was the most openly obstructionist to German unification because they feared another militarized Germany in the future. And also they'd gotten some sweet land and resources from the partition. The Allied Control Council, which was the governing body of occupied Germany, required unanimous consent. So the French often used their veto power to really push back against any actions that would create united systems, whether administrative or economic, across all four zones. The UK was also against reunification because of the economic turmoil at home that was being exacerbated by their occupation duties in Germany. They needed their zone to begin working to Britain's economic benefit, which meant foregoing elements of the 5Ds. A unified Germany would relinquish this economic opportunity to exploit a Germany that was not subdued. So ultimately, the Brits convinced the Americans that it was in their best interests to prevent unification, and instead build up West Germany as a capitalist bulwark. To learn more about this, because this is a very quick sketch that I gave, you can check out the book Drawing the Line of the American Decision to Divide Germany. And it goes into the gory details. Spoiler alert, the Soviet Union pushed for unification early and consistently. A united Germany wouldn't even be a communist Germany or even a socialist Germany, but that it would be a neutral democratic country. And following the war, the Soviet Union wanted peace. They wanted a peaceful neighbor that didn't have to be socialist.
And why would they want that, Tony?
So they wanted that. They wanted peace because the Soviet Union was utterly destroyed during World War
Why
II.
were they utterly destroyed, Tony?
I don't know. So if I recall, the last estimate that I saw of the casualties experienced during World War II was about 27 million people.
Right.
Of course, as a result of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And so, contrary to popular belief, they were in no position, had no desire to invade Western Europe following World War II. And I think we'll get to that later on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the Western powers definitely leveraged that, their desire to not fight a war in order to take as much as they could, basically.
Exactly. So the Western powers knew that a neutral Germany would not be advantageous for them, for their designs for Eastern Europe. For example, would a neutral Germany want to join NATO?
Could they? Probably not.
Exactly.
If you put enough Nazis in there.
Yeah, true. So the popular Western image of an evil communists wanting to divide Germany for their own nefarious purposes is very much akin to thinking that October 7th, 2023 was the start for the Israel-Palestine conflict. There wasn't a history prior to that. So I'm actually going to quote here from an ambassador, a U.S. ambassador. And so very early on, the U.S. knew that they weren't going to go for a united Germany. And this was very much against popular opinion. And so here's a quote from an American ambassador explaining that they knew what they were doing was against popular opinion, and they didn't want to make it seem as if they were doing this. So here's the quote here. It says, the difficulty which we labor that in spite of our announced position, we really do not want nor intend to accept German unification in any terms that the Russians might agree to, even though they seem to meet most of our requirements. And going further, he says that they have to really undertake some delicate maneuvering to avoid the appearance of inconsistency, if not hypocrisy. So they're very much aware of the fact that they were subverting not only agreements, but popular opinion.
I like how they were concerned about hypocrisy, which is something that seems to be not the case anymore. They don't give a fuck anymore whether they look like hypocrites.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. In regards to the examples of subversion during this early period, 1944 to 1949, we can see this play out in how the different sides dealt with the implementation of the 5Ds. So we're going to be looking at two of them now, democratization and decartelization. And decartelization means to break up or dissolve, in this specific case, of large industries, monopolies. Of course, if you're aware of the pre-World War II German history, the monopolized industries supported Hitler's rise to power and his eventual war aims. This specific D of decartelization was one that was really pushed by the Soviet Union at the Potsdam Conference in 1945. It really exposed that there was really a divide as to how to interpret these or how to carry out these specific Ds. So, for example, that's not how I anticipated that coming out.
God damn it. Here we are.
Yes. And this also goes, of course, for democratization. Both of these concepts are actually very closely interlinked because, of course, Marxist socialists hold a view of democracy that isn't rooted in simply parliamentary voting, but through a democratizing process that comes about through the ownership of the means of production and workers' participation in society. So the Soviets, of course, understood this. Leadership of the East Germans understood this as well. And that in order to bring democracy, they'd have to break up these cartels that supported the Nazi project. And they actually made good on this, interpretation of decartelization. And they did this by carrying out a massive nationalization process, which in a few years, I think nationalized about 40% of their GDP. There's a huge land reform that occurred as well, essentially destroying the hold that the Prussian, is it Junkers or Junkers, or I never know how to pronounce that either.
Is it? It's
Junkers?
It's probably Junkers, but I'm not positive.
Yeah. So essentially destroying the power that the landed nobility had in that part of Germany. This was a necessary part of the democratization. So these are the things that the Soviet Union and the East German leadership were concerned with in terms of class confrontation that was required to subdue fascist German elements. As one can imagine, this process of decartelization didn't really occur to a significant degree in any of the other four zones. And so I found this report from 1950 that actually is kind of like a post-mortem on the U.S. attempts to break up the industries in their zone, and tried to explain why. And here's a quote explaining why this author thought that the program on the U.S.'s part was a failure. I thought it was pretty funny. So the quote reads that the United States program might have operated satisfactorily had the individuals in final authority been sufficiently desirous of carrying it out. The plain fact is, however, that with the exception of a few clear-sighted individuals who recognize the true significance and the long-range importance of the program, those responsible for its application apparently either had little interest in the program or in varying degrees opposed to it. So essentially the program didn't work because they didn't want to do it.
Right.
Human nature.
Shocking.
Surprise, yeah. As mentioned, these aims weren't taken seriously in the Western zones, despite, again, popular support. So, for example, in Hessen, in the Western German zones, a referendum was held, which put forth the policy of potentially breaking up the banks, nationalizing certain industries, whether that's coal or other things. And this referendum passed with a 72% support. And the U.S. just vetoed that. They were like, we know you guys want that, but no, that's not happening. And similar votes occurred in like Rhineland-Westphalia, in Berlin, but that didn't matter. The U.S. military government forbade this from happening, and not only in their own zones, but they even interfered in the British and the French zones to prevent this from happening. So in the British zones, nationalization of coal industry stopped by the U.S. There's also laws, of course, about workers' participation as well in controlling commercial enterprises, and yes, those were all smacked down by the U.S. Occupying government, which was led by Lucius Clay. He was a general in the U.S. Army, and his name just makes me think of like a Batman villain or something. That's
a little bit.
That's, yeah, Lucius Clay.
The Iron Cross.
Exactly. So really preventing these nationalization attempts, this decartelization program, the democratization attempts for workers' control, pushing back against this was essentially a move to prevent unification, because these things were happening, again, in the eastern part of the zone to a very high degree. And so it was a consolidation of this power and unifying of the zones on an anti-socialist basis that occurred between the French, British, and the Americans that made disunity inevitable. So the lack of course, denazification was a huge deal as well, but we'll get to that later. So as a result of these shenanigans by the Western powers, continuously moving away from these preset agreements at Potsdam in 1945. Other things occurred after that, including a currency reform, issues of the West not paying reparations, sufficient reparations to the Soviet Union. West Germany was formally declared on May 23rd, 1949, as, of course, the sole and true representation of the German people. And East Germany, a few months later, in response, was actually officially declared as well.
Yeah, and a lot of this we do cover in that GDR episode, where it's, the U.S. created the dollar-backed Deutschmark, which completely fucked the East because West Germany, because the U.S., French, and UK territories were not paying reparations to the Soviet Union. It meant that East Germany, the Soviet-controlled territory, was the only group that was paying back, which sort of then hamstrung the East German economy. It was such a shitty situation.
Those things you just mentioned, those are all attempts at subversion. And even before these countries were formed as separate entities, West Germany itself was established as a way to subvert this democratization process that was happening in East Germany, which I viewed as problematic, of course, because it was a threat, is a problematic example, but also, of course, a threat to capitalist domination in Germany. And as we all know, every subversive attempt or subversive program needs a base. And the subversion of East Germany found its base in Berlin, the city of spies.
Ooh.
Listeners, I recommend you pull out your map of divided Germany to see how everyone has one of those, right?
Yeah.
Got 3 on the wall right now.
to see how deep the city of Berlin is in the territory of East Germany. I'm sure you're likely aware that Berlin was separated into 2 zones, West Berlin, of course, for the Western powers, and East Berlin for the Eastern powers. I always used to think growing up that Berlin was somehow on the border between these 2 countries, right?
Yeah, that's how I imagined it as a child. Yeah,
exactly. That's just the way it'd be. But it's actually located 100 miles from the border with West Germany, deep in East Germany's territory. How is this situation even possible? Because it's just so ridiculous that we'll get to how ridiculous it is. But essentially, as part of the Potsdam Agreement in 1945, Berlin itself was supposed to be essentially like a 5th international sector that neither country was supposed to really have too much power in. But obviously, once the idea of unification was breaking down in the end of the 40s, the Western powers and even the Soviet Union consolidated their zones, especially because it became clear what a major security problem Berlin was for the Eastern Bloc, what a value it was to the Western countries.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to subversion of East Germany, really all roads lead to West Berlin.
Right.
So much so that the Soviets actually tried to force out the Allies out of Berlin in 1948 by imposing a land blockade on the western sectors of the city, known as the Berlin Blockade. And again, I recommend people check out that episode that Jeremy had just mentioned. You guys go into a lot more detail about the causes for that and what eventually happened. What occurred in that blockade is that all access was cut off by road to West Berlin, which led to the Western powers having to airlift supplies to West Berlin at the time. Yeah, so what I'll just say about the blockade is that the blockade eventually ended because, again, as Justin had mentioned, the Soviet Union wasn't interested in starting a war. And so this period that we're talking about here between 1945 and 61 was considered really the best intelligence gathering that was ever done by Western powers against not only East Germany, but the Eastern Bloc as a whole. And this is something that liberal sources like openly admit, that West Berlin was like the perfect chef's kiss. It was like
they just want democracy then.
Exactly. Yeah, they just want democracy, but it was like the best spy base that one could want. And so in 1961, it was estimated that about 80% of the spies that East Germany arrested had actually been recruited in West Berlin.
Jesus.
Here's a quote by a BND officer. So the BND was essentially like the CIA for West Germany. So in a West German magazine in 1968, he wrote that the history of spying knows no better base than West Berlin. Western intelligence services really had 2 goals when it came to spying on East Germany. They wanted a warning of an alleged attack by the Soviet army if that was ever to occur. But of course, that was really never in the plan on the part of the Soviets. And of course, East Germany was essentially the perfect place to penetrate the Soviet Union deeper, because the Soviet Union was really their main target, and East Germany provided an opportunity to do so without having to actually to actually what's the word? To actually fuck it. I'll fix that in post. Okay.
Fuck it. We'll do it live.
Exactly.
Or you mean like infiltrate or like what do you
exactly. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for getting me on track. Yeah. So it was because I didn't want to say penetrate again.
It was real hard not to laugh. I had to like tough. Bite my tongue.
I said it again. I said it and I was like, But
I got a one joke about sex per 30 minutes. Yeah. So we got to wait another 6 minutes.
It would have been okay if you hadn't said deeper, like right after.
Oh gosh. Yeah. So essentially it was easier to infiltrate. Perfect word. Thank you for that. The Soviet Union through the GDR. So how easy was it for Western agencies to, again, I wrote penetrate East Germany, okay. To infiltrate East Germany. So following the war, after the Soviets had their own zone, many Germans who supported the Nazi regime ended up fleeing to the Western controlled zones because it was understood that they would have less repercussions by moving there. But of course, there were just general people who just maybe didn't agree with communism or were allured by what was happening in West Germany at the time. But this actually led to millions, about 3 million people leaving East Germany between 1949 to 1961 before the wall was put into place. This huge emigration of people had a major devastating impact on early East Germany's economy. Often the people that left were people who were specialists in different fields, whether they're doctors, engineers. Really, every single part of society was being drained to West Berlin. This was happening in a way that was beneficial to West Germany. They had an influx of people, of specialists in a variety of fields, but most importantly, it allowed them to create an extensive network to hire spies from the refugees that were entering the country. What occurred is that when people would emigrate to West Germany from East Germany, is that they would be interrogated. They'd be in a room with perhaps a CIA agent, an MI6 agent, and virtually every Western power had a agency office set up there. And these people would be asked about their relatives, about what their life was like, about the industry that they worked in, and if, most importantly, they knew anybody who would be willing to be a spy, if not themselves. There's even a book written about this called Interrogation Nation, which I recommend people check out. As far as I understand, no other country has done this to this level, utilizing immigrants, essentially, or refugees fleeing something in order to subvert the government that they were coming from. Often people think about the Stasi, which was the security services of East Germany, as being the leaders of some large state surveillance system. But really, West Germany also had a similar extensive surveillance system of East Germans through this interrogation of refugees that flowed in. And in fact, actually...
maybe you could call it Nazi.
Womp, womp, womp.
So really, the main way spies were recruited were through these refugees or emigres from East Berlin, because there was essentially no border between East and West Berlin. There were many streets that were just open passageways, one that could walk through. There were checkpoints, of course, but those could always be avoided. Kind of getting back to the people that were interrogated. So say, for example, you're a scientist and you want to go to West Germany. You just walk over the line, I guess, on the ground between the Berlins. They interrogate you and you tell them that I worked in this industry and I know about 5 guys in my office who'd be willing to spy for you guys, and I'll spy for you as well, provided, of course, that I get something out of it. So again, this was a huge network that was developed through this interrogation system. This was a great benefit, of course, to the West Germans, because normally when it came to spying, it was quite a complicated process. We've all seen spy movies. Say, for example, maybe someone that communicates with their handler by sending out a letter or by doing dead drops with a courier, and there's all these different steps involved. But literally all it took for a spy to communicate from East Berlin to West Berlin was to just walk down the street, right? There wasn't a series of ways that one could be intercepted before a message got through either way. The only risk was, I guess, maybe being caught crossing the checkpoint. The checkpoint, yeah. So there's a variety of ways also that people were also tricked essentially into being spies or potential spies. So say, for example, there'd be job interviews that would be posted for West Berlin in East Germany, and people would show up and they'd be like, awesome, I'm ready to be interviewed. And they'd be like, actually, we want you to be a spy. So already they're kind of put in this compromising position where they could follow through if they wanted to, but they could also leave and potentially be seen as a subversive in denying this opportunity without necessarily the Stasi knowing.
What's the health insurance like for spy?
It's a good question. I'm assuming actually that it was very good. I guess maybe that's one thing that I should point out about West Berlin is that the city compared to East Berlin had a wild amount of resources dumped into it as opposed to East Berlin. And this was essentially done to give the impression, of course, that West Germany as a whole was this like perfect paradise because West Berlin was very nice. But again, ironically, it's one of the things communist countries always get accused of creating this false image of a country. You go to North Korea and it's all fake. And they're only showing you the good parts, but like that's literally what West Berlin was.
I guess the fact that West Germany was not having to pay reparations on the same scale was also a huge factor as well.
Okay, so here's one of the ways that they trapped people into spying. So, or to at least put them in front of a recruiter. One person was actually recruited, and he was instructed to go back home. This guy was a doctor who was recruited by West German spies. So he went back to East Berlin, and he was instructed to go back and tell his patients who had important jobs, whether it was in like a nationalized factory or they're engineers, whatever, and tell his patients that, oh, you're seriously ill. And the only medicine that could treat you is in West Berlin.
Wow.
So, of course, they would be recommended that they go there and collect the drugs that were, of course, free. And once they got there, that's when they would be approached to be like, hey, you want to spy? And some of these patients of this dude, actually, that I'm talking about, they reported it to the Stasi and they ended up arresting the guy.
Was it like a CIA agent with like a trench coat and he's just like opens it? He's got like 10 different kinds of drugs hanging from the inside of his coat. It's like, hey,
essentially what
hey,
it was
kid.
like, except it was West Berlin. So it was nice. It was fancy. It was a fancy coat he was wearing. Also different ways people were lured was like the most classic of like a beautiful woman, you know, or a prostitute, whatever, attracting a man to come over. Again, I found this interesting reading about because honeypots are usually associated with Russia, you know, with the Soviet Union. But I mean, again, the CIA, everyone implemented such tactics in terms of for their spying. So the different organizations that were spying in or who had their spy bases in West Germany, of course, included the CIA, the MI6, and many other intelligence agencies. Other groups which were based in West Berlin, which were used to subvert East Germany, were resistance organizations, the original resistance libs, that were often fronts for these different intelligence agencies. In the late 1950s, it was suggested that there were probably about 80 American, West German, British, and French intelligence units that were active in West Berlin. Units that would be sometimes comprised of hundreds of people, if not thousands. And they were spying on all aspects of East German life, scientific research, development, industrial production, and of course, military matters. Berlin allowed for the West Germany to subvert East Germany in a variety of ways. They could start uprisings from there. They could subvert the economy. They could sabotage things. They could even intercept communications via tunnel, which I'll get to later. And so in kind of reviewing this information, I was like, I don't think there's a parallel for this in any other country in which their capital city, Berlin was East Germany's capital city, was shared with essentially a hostile power deep in their territory. So like there's no analogy, there's no parallel that could be made. It was just a huge, essentially gaping wound in the middle of Germany that was working to destroy it, East Germany.
Right. Like if the Soviet Union controlled half of Washington, D.C. or something.
Exactly, yeah.
Not only do they control half of Washington, D.C., but they have a a road that leads all the way from like Alaska through the whole country to get there.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that they had unlimited resources to convince, U.S. people to spy on their home country.
And so essentially one of the main groups of people, or I guess ways these different intelligence agencies funded subversion was through these front groups in East Germany, resistance groups, as I mentioned, but also paramilitary stay-behind groups and fascist organizations. So we've already tackled some of the 5Ds, and I guess one we're going to look at now is denazification, which...
I didn't say anything.
Oh. Okay, so which theoretically meant the removal of Nazi influence and organizations and ideology in places or positions of power. And I'm sure anyone who's vaguely familiar with this show or my show or any socialist podcast knows that this supposed denazification was bullshit, and that Western powers facilitated the use on a grand scale of former Nazis in everything from intelligence gathering to a government administration to commanders of NATO, etc. So these are just a huge group of anti-communist fascists that were just waiting to be mobilized. They're just begging to kind of be put in play. Probably the most prominent of these, which operated in West Germany, in West Berlin, was the Gehlen organization, which was founded shortly after World War II, which found its name from its founder, or the man who was put in charge of it, Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of intelligence on the Eastern Front for the Nazis. And so shortly before the war ended, he could tell that, the winds weren't blowing in their favor. And so he turned himself into the US with a trove of documentation, which they loved. And of course, they're like, rather than being like, hey, you literally are a perpetrator of the Holocaust, they're like, hey, do you want a job?
Right.
And not only a job, we're essentially going to give you unlimited resources and access to carry out the objective we have for you, which of course was to continue the job he had under the Nazis, spy on the Soviet Union to destroy it. So this Gehlen organization was really considered the best organized of these or subverting agencies because it had the best agents. Again, these were fascist intelligence officers who after the war were just really hankering to do some anti-communism.
And they didn't just do it in Germany or in Europe. They were sent to Africa to destroy nascent socialist movements down there as well. Some of the people that were recruited were Nazi SS officers who were then just shifted from direct military intervention to covert military intervention.
Not their best.
I mean, from a certain point of view, but like their best were the worst,
And I think it was even Che Guevara, one of the people who helped hunt him down in Bolivia, was a famous Nazi collaborator, or not even Nazi collaborator, Nazi who the U.S. had supported in South America. And Gehlen, of course, was also connected to other fascist groups such as the OUN and the UPA, which we'll actually be talking more in depth about these Ukrainian fascists in future episodes. The best way to understand Reinhard Gehlen and the Gehlen organization is think of Gehlen as Nick Fury, fascists, and the Gehlen organization as S.H.I.E.L.D. Right? Because even though they may have been presented by the CIA and Western countries as being the good guys, right? They were all Hydras, Hydra all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
This actually had a profound impact that the Gehlen organization and other fascist organizations were leading the charge for intelligence gathering. Because despite it really being obvious that after World War II, the Soviets were really not wanting to engage in war against Western Europe, all the information, or not all the information, but the vast majority, I think it was like 70% of the information coming in about the Soviet Union at this time in the 40s was from the Gehlen organization. And they were suggesting that the Soviets were actually wanting to start another conflict. And that's just because these fascists wanted to finish the job that they failed at before, which was to destroy the Soviet Union. And here's a former CIA agent had this to say about Galen. He said, the agency loved Galen because, referring to the CIA here, the agency loved Galen because he fed us what we wanted to hear. We used his stuff constantly and we fed it to everybody else. The Pentagon, the White House, newspapers, they loved it too. But it was hyped up Russian boogeyman junk and it did a lot of damage to this country, referring to the US. Another organization that was against the GDR was known as the KGU in German, but in English it was known as the Fighting Group Against Inhumanity. And one thing I've noticed is how terrible fascist organizations' names are.
Yeah.
And like they all like kind of like try to sound like good, but it's like they sound good in an evil way. Right?
Yeah.
It's like no,
They don't understand
like
irony.
So this organization was founded in West Berlin in 1948, again made up of a ton of anti-communists, but again people who were very skilled at the jobs that they did. And so here's a listing of some of the activities that they engaged in East Germany. And this is from William Blum's book, Killing Hope. So I'm just going to quickly read through some examples of the subversive work they were up to, which really ranged from stuff that was relatively juvenile to just straight up terrorism. This fighting group against inhumanity did things such as use explosive, arson, short-circuiting, and other methods to damage power stations, shipyards, dams, canals, docks, public buildings, gas stations, shops, and other public transportation in East Germany. They derailed freight trains, seriously injuring people. They blew up roads and railway bridges. They placed explosives on railroad bridges between Berlin and Moscow. They used acids to damage vital factory machinery. They put sand into the turbines of factories. They killed 7,000 cows in a cooperative by poisoning the wax coating of the wire used to bale the cow's corn fodder. And this one was really ridiculous. They added soap to powdered milk destined for East German schools.
Jesus, dude.
Fuck.
Yeah. They floated balloons which burst in the air, scattering propaganda pamphlets, etc. They forged and distributed large quantities of food ration cards, for example, for 60,000 pounds of meat. And this, of course, caused confusion, shortages, and resentment because that just didn't exist, right? They didn't have that.
Because in communism, no food.
And they gave considerable aid and comfort to East Germans who staged the 1953 uprising. These are just a few of the examples. I didn't read out the full list here of the subversive work that was happening. Again, based in West Berlin, in a country that was in a city that was essentially in the middle of East Germany. There's other front organizations as well. I found the name of this one interesting: the Association of Victims of Stalinism. So I just think that group this is like the original victims of communism.
Yeah, Stalinism doesn't exist, so there are no victims. Victims of unicorns.
And so, so these resistance organizations, again, played a key role in subverting East Germany in a way that almost flipped what the situation was in the Second World War, which was how communist resistance organizations were used to fight against Nazis in occupied Western Europe. Now these different fascist-related organizations were being used to subvert communists in the Soviets as well.
Yeah, there seems to be like a concerted effort to disconnect the politics of resistance fighters in Western Europe from socialism and communism, but the vast majority of them were, or if they were not explicitly socialist or communist, they at least were made up of largely socialists and communists in their ranks, because who else is going to fucking fight fascists? Liberals don't give a fuck. They're living their lives fairly comfortably.
So let's get talking about economic subversion. Outside of like straight up sabotage, blowing up of railway bridges and of factories and things like that, probably the main form of economic subversion which occurred was what's known as the Hallstein Doctrine, which is named after a West German politician. And so essentially, this was a policy that ran from roughly 1955 to the mid-70s, about 20 years. And what this policy was that West Germany, which is now backed, of course, by the US and the capitalist world system in general, said that if any country were to officially recognize the German Democratic Republic, whether through any kind of diplomatic effort or trading or anything really, that this would be regarded as an unfriendly act against West Germany, meaning that West Germany wouldn't deal with you then.
Right.
So this obviously had a great impact on the ability for this really, at the time, struggling country, socialist country, to develop good relations with the international community. East German passports weren't even recognized in other places. They couldn't create embassies in other countries. They couldn't do certain payments that were forbidden. Even though it wasn't officially, some kind of specific sanctions regime, that's how it played out in reality. East Germany was sanctioned from the beginning by the most powerful countries in the world. Very similar scenario to every socialist country. I think every socialist country has been sanctioned at some point, even China for a while. North Korea, of course, still is, and Cuba. So this also prevented them from participating in organizations such as the World Health Organization, kind of important, the International Labor Organization, UNESCO, World Bank. Maybe that one's a good thing. I guess the GDR did their best to work around this sanctions regime, and they did this by forming close ties with national liberation movements in the Third World, parts in Africa and Asia, Vietnam, in Namibia. This was, of course, great, but it wasn't enough when you're not able to deal with the already industrialized nations that were leading the global economy. And in fact, one of the last countries to recognize the GDR was the US, and this was in 1974. So before that, they didn't have official diplomatic relations with them. One of the main ways that the GDR was subverted was through this open border, which they lost millions of people through. I think it's somewhere between 20% of the population pre-1961 left to West Germany, and these are the best and the brightest scientists, doctors, people in key positions.
Right, because if you're like the average worker, the average garment factory worker or steel worker or whatever truck driver, you're not going to have a better life in West Germany. But if you're a doctor, or you are a lawyer or a scientist or an engineer, again, because there's lots of money being pumped into West Germany by the Allied powers and particularly by the United States, that's a very attractive prospect for you to leave this sort of socialist project that's being developed, in which you might not receive the same level of compensation. You could live a comfortable, bourgeois sort of life over there in West Germany. So, yeah.
And it's not like all of them were even, just independently being like, yo, I can make more money in the West. And a lot of the time they were approached by...
Right, actively recruited.
Yeah. And like, hey, we'll give you this amount of money if you come work here.
I think, as Jeremy had stated before, East Germany began, at least after its foundation in 1949, already in a bad economic situation due to the Western zones refusing to pay their part of the reparations,
right?
Which on the part of the Soviet Union led to them essentially deindustrializing East Germany for a period of time up until 1953, where they realized, oh shit, this probably wasn't the best.
I mean, what were they supposed to do,
Well, and they did that before they knew what was going to happen, because if Germany had been unified, as was the plan, then they did not also want to be in the position that this would be a jumping off point for a Western invasion of the Soviet Union or anything of that nature. So yes, so when the Soviet military was pulling out of East Germany, they dismantled factories and shit and brought them back to the Soviet Union, because they were like, oh, this will be good for us. We're going to get reparations from the entire country anyway, but we will take this just in case.
Right. I mean, it was the second time that they had been invaded by Germany in the same 50-year span.
Right.
So yeah, the Hallstein Doctrine, coupled with the position East Germany started in, meant that it was being strangled economically by the Western capitalist countries. Looking at another way in which the country was subverted, you can look at the example of a tunnel. So generally leftists love tunnels, right? Socialist tunnels. We got those Vietnamese tunnels.
Hell yeah.
Right? Got those Chinese tunnels.
Hell yeah.
Got those Hamas tunnels. Tunnels are based, of course, unless they're fascist. And so in this case, there's a plot by the CIA and MI6 entitled Operation Golden, also Operation Regal, and PB jointly. There's like a variety of names for it, which is a bit confusing when I was looking it up, but I think that they all refer to different aspects of the intelligence gathering. That's kind of what I picked up from that. So essentially, in the early 50s, starting in 1953, the MI6 and the CIA wanted to build an underground tunnel to tap into the Soviet military communication system, which operated out of East Berlin.
I mean, that's so greedy. They already had all the spy shit.
10,000 spies hanging out. Yeah.
It's not enough.
It's like they're like, we have a spy base in the middle of your country, but we need more. And so there's actually a massive project because it required them to build this. I think it was like maybe 500-meter tunnel or something underneath West Berlin into East Berlin, and then essentially plug into or tap into the landline communication system of the Soviet army.
All without the East Germans noticing this, all the dirt that they had to export.
That too. And I think what was interesting too is that where they had to actually make the connection to this landline system, it was just like, I think 19 inches below the surface. So it's like, it wasn't like it was like deep down or something, right? Like it was like underneath like a normal street in East Berlin. But somehow they're able to do it. So I guess they get props for that, I guess. But through this tapping of this Soviet military system, they recorded over 400,000 conversations between the Soviets and East Germans. So this was a project which required hundreds of people to do all the different technical stuff, to transcribe things, to record things, to kind of parse through the information. It was for a long time believed, at least for the few years that it was, or few years it was in operation, to be a massively successful operation on the part of the CIA. After all, they'd done all this without the Soviets knowing, without the East Germans knowing. But it turned out that actually wasn't the case. And that the Soviets were aware of this program from the beginning, before they'd even started using their spoons to dig up the hole or whatever, the tunnel.
So how did they get the tunnel dug without, I mean, obviously the Soviets did find out about it, but how did they do it clandestinely? What was the process?
Yeah, so essentially they had a U.S. where the hole was dug from was a warehouse, which they said was like a U.S. military base or whatever, right? And they dug using hydraulic rams, which I guess dug through the ground. I don't really know. I don't have too much information about that, but they were able to do it. As I was saying, that the Soviets knew before they'd even begun the digging process that this project was happening. And they knew this because of their spy, George Blake, who was embedded in Western intelligence agencies. I recommend people to look up this guy's bio. He actually died just a few years ago at the age of 99 or 98 or whatever. He was recruited by the Soviets in North Korea, of all places, after he was captured during the Korean War. So yeah, check that out. But anyways, so the Soviets knew about this project, but they did seemingly nothing to prevent it from occurring, which is interesting. I couldn't really find, I don't know, Justin, if you can find out the exact reason why they didn't. It seems like it was...
I don't know that I've seen anything about it, but I would just assume because they were in such a terrible bargaining position that they couldn't be taking hostile action against the US, basically.
Well, but also it's sort of like if you know that somebody's spying on you, you can misdirect them. You know what I mean? It's possible to give them misinformation or make sure that your communications through this particular line don't, give away anything vital or whatever.
So the Soviets end up exposing it after about a year and a half of this wiretap being in place. And they made a huge media thing about it. In fact, it was actually the most publicized peacetime espionage operation that had been uncovered. It was kind of like a, look, how could they do this to us?
Mm-hmm.
How could they? And there's if you look online, you can find the photos of it. And the British and the Americans were surprised because they had anticipated that if the Soviets had found it, that they wouldn't say anything about it, because it is pretty embarrassing for such a project to take place without them being aware of it. But because they did know about it before the start, it appears that they were waiting to use this as an opportunity to demonstrate the subversion attempts that are actively occurring to East Germany and to the whole Soviet bloc. So getting to what East Germany did in response to some of these things. I'm sure most people, of course, are familiar with what's known as the Stasi, or the secret police, so-called secret police of East Germany. And what's interesting is that prior to about 1950, and of course, today they're known as being the heads of this mass surveillance state, which is made up of a network of informants. So, like, you could rely on different people to inform on other people, etc. And it turns out that the initial forms of the Stasi didn't operate like that, and that didn't change until 1953, as a response to many of these subversion attempts that had been occurring. So, say for example, even just looking at the way refugees or emigres leaving East Germany to West Germany were being interrogated, right? The Stasi understood that if their enemy was going to be doing that they had to have some form of system where they could rely on East Germans in East Germany to inform them about what is going on. So the Stasi didn't start as this informant network, but as a response to subversive attempts from West Germany. That's what led to that creation of that specific surveillance state that existed.
Yeah, it's sort of crazy to me when people are like, oh, communist nations are oppressive. Like they're not doing it for fun. Like there's a reason, there's a material set of circumstances that these nations developed under, and they're only responding to it. That's how it works. Like if there was a constant imminent threat here in the United States, you better believe we'd be living under a police state of some kind,
You aren't?
Well, I mean, certain sectors of this country are, but you know what I mean? I guess it would be more broad, more widespread, and white people would feel it,
And so things changed for the Stasi in 1953, specifically as a result of the uprising which occurred, known as the June Uprising. It entailed at least the participation of over 1 million East Germans. There were demonstrations, work stoppages, violence. Buildings were set ablaze. Prisoners were freed. Many of the people who were freed were Nazis. Official buildings were seized. Riots were ensued, etc. And these were in response to what was called the New Course, which was the East German government's attempts to accelerate the building of socialism in East Germany, which unfortunately included increased hours of work for less pay. This, among with the other pressures that are being placed on East Germany economically, led to this uprising, and of course with the support of other subversive groups in the country. And so the Stasi did not predict that this was going to happen, which again demonstrates further that they were not this mass surveillance organization prior to this point. But the fact that they didn't know that it was even a potential to happen meant that they had to change. They had to do something to prevent it from happening. And again, this informant network was created in response to that. It was actually following this in 1953, in the years 54, 1955, that there were major operations carried out by both the Soviet Union and East Germany in terms of arresting spies and others subversive. So, say for example, hundreds, I think somewhere upwards of 500 members of the Gehlen organization were arrested in East Germany. The KGU, the Fighters of Inhumanity, or whatever they were called, again, their network was pretty much smashed during this time period as well. But these spies included people who were like scientists, engineers, soldiers, police officers, doctors. And the Stasi, the form that it took was in response to these early subversive attempts that were happening in the country. But of course, they couldn't totally quell all these subversive attempts, whether it was the economic subversion, whether it was the sabotage that was occurring. And so something had to be done because West Berlin, again, a spy base in the center of their country, made it impossible for the situation in East Germany to be stabilized to a degree where they could actually feel secure, confident to build socialism in that country.
Right.
Something had to be done, and Walter Ulbricht, who was the head of the SED at the time, the ruling party in East Germany, going back to 1952, he had wanted the border in in Berlin, between West and East Berlin, to be fortified, to not necessarily maybe a wall, but there had to be something put in place to protect the country. The Soviets were not really for that. Again, they still held some sway in regards to what East Germany did because they didn't want to start military conflict over this matter. It just wasn't seen as worth it. And it was like that during the Berlin airlift. They were like, it's not worth us fighting a war. We'd rather just let them have the city. But they were eventually able to convince the Soviets under Khrushchev to do this. In 1958, he issued an ultimatum giving the Western powers 6 months to leave Berlin and to make it a free and demilitarized city. And what's awesome is that you can check out the statement that he made in regards to this. And he made such an excellent argument because what was happening is that the Western powers were saying that, well, the reason we have Berlin and it's legitimate for us to stay in West Berlin is because of the agreements post-war. We all agreed to it. It was in the Potsdam Agreement. But then the Soviets and East Germans in response were like, yeah, but that's the only part of the agreement that you hold to.
Right. Yeah.
Like literally the only thing. So if you don't think that the majority parts of this agreement are legitimate or should be followed through on, again, the 5 Ds, then you have no right over West Berlin. We agree. These agreements don't mean anything. So yeah, here's a quote from Khrushchev. So he said that the German Democratic Republic has scrupulously observed the stipulations of the Potsdam Agreement with regard to the eradication of militarism and the liquidation of the monopolies, while the Western powers have permitted the revival of militarism and economic imperialism in the German Federal Republic. So yeah, I recommend people check out that letter because it makes sense. He makes a very clear argument. There was no legitimately good reason for Western powers to stay in West Berlin. Yeah, and so in response, the Western powers said, particularly the USA, they made the argument that maintaining their presence in West Berlin was actually very important for American security.
Oh,
something that they never really explained.
How did American security end up in West Berlin? How did it get there?
Got lost along the way. And so something had to give. And in August 1961, I believe it's August 13th, 1961, the construction began on the Berlin Wall. And it was a surprise, actually, to the Western powers. Maybe not so much in the sense that something was to occur for the East Germans to address it. But they hadn't anticipated that the wall was going to be constructed on the day it was. Of course, it was quite alarming because it could have been interpreted as again, as the Western powers always want to interpret things, as a war or a declaration of war against the West. But really, it was an attempt to maintain their sovereignty in the face of their sovereignty not being respected or not being accepted, even because again, this is the period of the Holstein Doctrine. So most countries weren't even accepting them as a legitimate nation. And so I found this this wild analogy that was made in this book that I was reading, and they said that in the 80s, Reagan argued that a state that's unable to, so Ronald Reagan argued that the state is unable to control its borders. If a state is unable to control its borders, that it ceases to function as a state. And it's like the only like one thing that like Reagan said that was like true. Despite the major ideological differences, East Germans would have supported this idea. The lack of the border wall, it impacted their territorial integrity, it impacted their economy, and it impacted their sovereignty. and that they could no longer strategically accept this form of subversion in their country. What I'll say kind of to wrap up all of this is that when it comes to the Berlin Wall, of course, there's a lot of controversy surrounding it, and I think the goal of this, the show isn't necessarily to defend anything; it's to explain things, right? To get a deeper and better understanding. And when it comes to the Berlin Wall, there's essentially zero context which is ever provided for its construction, rather than outside of it being created purposefully to divide Germany or to increase communist aggression. Because what ends up happening after the wall actually is that the East German situation was able to stabilize for a prolonged period. They had less spies. I think if you look at the number of spies that they were arresting after the wall, it just plummets like dramatically. Before they were like arresting like literally a network of like 500 people in like a day.
Sure.
Something, right? And after it'd be like, oh, maybe we got 100 in a year or something like that. Yeah, it was a massive stabilization on their part. People would accurately argue that the other reason for the creation of this wall was to stem the flow of emigres into West Germany. And maybe that's a topic for another episode where we can discuss the freedom or the restriction of movement in the Soviet bloc. But yeah, I just think that that's the main point I want to get across, is that East Germany, more so than potentially any other country in history, was being subverted by a hostile power who controlled half of its capital city. And if one understands that reality, then they'll understand why the SED, the ruling government in power, determined that it was necessary to build the wall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Any thoughts?
I guess I think a lot of leftists who are not Marxist-Leninists, but even some who are, really like to engage in, but what if they had done this instead? But that's it's fun sometimes. Like what if Kirov had not been assassinated? Like, what if Stalin had enough foresight to recognize Khrushchev and his liberalism, but he didn't, Kirov died. He was assassinated, and Stalin did not recognize what a pain in the ass Khrushchev was going to become. You can't engage with what if in anything more than like a thought experiment way, like like it's fun to think about this, or let's imagine what it might have been like. But that's not a functioning way of addressing history or politics. You have to engage with what actually happened, and that's what happened. The wall was built because of these two major factors: brain drain and security concerns. Were there other ways to handle that? Maybe. Were there better ways? Probably not. Like there might not one that would be as cheap to do for this struggling nation. I think one of your guests mentioned in one of your episodes on the GDR that only 2% of reparations paid to the Soviet Union came from West Germany. The other 98% came from East Germany. So if they're already kind of under that kind of economic pressure, they don't have unlimited resources. They don't have a benefactor like the United States, which in terms of the economic and military impact on the United States, it was nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the Soviet Union. So the United States could afford to pour, I forget how much it was. I think it was like 40 million or 65 million. I forget how much it was, again, in like 1950s and 60s dollars into West Germany to improve the conditions there. The Soviet Union was in no position to do that. So again, you can't logically engage with what could have been. You can only logically engage with what is or was. And that is what happened. So can we learn lessons from the GDR? Obviously, but it has to be with the things that actually happened there, not what we wish had happened there.
I guess maybe as an ending response to kind of what you just said here, what if the Soviet Union had half of Washington?
Yeah.
Washington, D.C.
What would that
How
look
would
like?
how would have they responded?
Yeah. Do you think
I
they
think-
would have
I
built
think
a wall?
Yeah, I think we'll leave that. I actually personally don't even think they would have been overrun.
They would have started a war.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
We'll leave you guys with that. Thanks for listening.
Justin?
That about does it for this episode. Thank you so much, Tony, and to all of our listeners. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolespod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all that algorithm stuff. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
Solidarity forever.
All right.
Awesome.
You're the best, Tony. I'll see you whenever.
Yeah, for sure. Good luck.
Yeah, we'll after we're done here, we'll figure out when next weekend we can do the bonus episode and whatever else we might need to do housekeeping wise.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye.
See ya.
What, Tony? That is so interesting.
The 5 Ds. Never forget.
Don't forget the 5 Ds.
The 5 D. Penetrate deep into their territory.